Yeah. Yeah.
All right, welcome everyone to University of Texas Energy Symposium hosted by the Energy Institute. I'm Kerry King, Assistant Director and Research Scientist at the Energy Institute. Today we have our Director as well, Dr. Brian Corrigal in the audience joining us. And before I introduce today's speakers more formally, I'll just bring up the next two talks for the symposium. And I will try to close this out. So next week we'll have Rob Threlkeld, who's the Senior Manager of Power and Utility Strategies at General Motors. He's kind of in charge of buying the energy to run General Motors plants, manufacturing facilities. So we'll hear a bit about that. And then February 7th, we'll have William Reese, or Bill Reese, who's an emeritus professor from the Faculty of Applied Science, School of Community and Regional Planning, University of British Columbia. Anybody's heard of the ecological footprint? Bill is kind of the co-founder or co-originator of the idea of the ecological footprint, about like how much land area a person requires to deal with all of their consumption, right? So when people calculate we're consuming something like 3 Earths worth of resources, a lot of that idea of that calculation stems from work he did as a student at the time. But today, it's a pleasure to have, I think, kind of special talk today. So we're not having a technical talk. We're having 2 journalists. So we're having Andy Uhler, who is an energy journalism fellow with us here at University of Texas, the Energy Institute. He's also a fellow at the University of Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, and he's a former or semi-still involved reporter for Marketplace. If anybody listens to the daily show Marketplace on as part of many people's NPR stations in the afternoon or evenings. And along with him, we're going to have Mose Buchele, who is a reporter here at our local station, KUT. And he is created what got some acclaim. I think I enjoyed it. A series about the February 2021 blackouts. That's called The Disconnect: Power, Politics, and the Texas Blackout. So he studies energy and the environment, or reports on energy and the environment. So Andy and Mose here are to answer all of your questions about how hard it is or how fun it is to extract information out of people in companies, universities, governments, policymakers, to help explain to the public what in the world is going on in the world of energy. So just a brief biography on them as well. I've already stated some of it. Andy Uhler, he's got a degree from here, from the Public Policy School as well, Master of Public Affairs. And as I stated, he worked for American Public Media's Marketplace, and he helped launch the Texas Standard, which is a weekly series on kind of all things going on in Texas. So it's quite a good series on that. And Mose reported on energy and environment since 2011. And as I mentioned already, he focused a lot on the power grid and the Texas blackouts. So today they're going to give us a sort of combination talk, and then we'll take Q&A from them on reporting on the energy industry and the challenges associated with that from a reporter's perspective, and from someone like me who has reporters call them and ask them questions, and you're supposed to say something complicated in 10 seconds. They're going to explain to us other ways or pros and cons of doing that kind of thing. So without further ado, I will now hand it over to Mose and Andy, and they will speak for 20 or 30 minutes, just discussing their perspectives, and then we'll take questions from the audience and those of you online. I will be looking for your questions online as well, so I will try to get those. Cool. All right. Let's see if I can find your those on the wrong size. All right. So you think?
I think up there and like.
All right. So you know how to. Well, I guess that's cool. If you know how to do it better. All right.
So I'm Andy, by the way. Thank you guys for being here. I'm Mose. Mose and I have known each other for 20 years now. Yeah, it's crazy. And so we were both interns at KUT. I think I was definitely an intern. Yeah, you were. I started as an intern there as well. We were both. Well, we both have history at UT. We were both grad students. Yeah, different times. Yeah. But in sort of the way that we wanted to do this, right, is have because all we do is ask people questions all the time. So we're going to kind of ask one another questions as we go through these slides. to sort of, I think, elicit, because the things that I'm doing for Marketplace and things he's doing for KUT or doing for this specific podcast are going to be just kind of inherently different. My perspective is going to have to be a little more sort of geared toward a national audience. Yours can be, you tell me.
Well, I mean, really, a lot of it is also the difference between podcasting and broadcast radio. If you like embark on doing a series specific to a very specific issue, like the power grid, for example, you're going to be having an audience that is coming to you much more.
Yeah.
If you're going to be putting on a radio broadcast that is just going to catch people in their cars on their drive home, right? You're going to be trying to fashion a different kind of story. You're going to be trying to fashion a story that is just going to try to grab people, with no previous understanding of what they're hearing.
Yeah.
So that might be one good way to set up any differences that we come across. Another way we were thinking about is differences between industry and policy reporting.
Yeah.
At Marketplace, Andy does a lot of industry reporting and business reporting. It's kind of like the framing of that show, though it's obviously a lot more. At our station, I have focused a lot recently on policy. Of course, there's a ton of overlap there. So that's another kind of way to think about it, maybe. But basically, I think our hope is to keep this pretty informal, talk a little bit about personal histories. And I'm just kind of curious also in terms of, I know we have an online audience as well, but people here in the room with us, have any of you had to take media calls before, or do you anticipate in your career needing to translate, the focus of your work to a more general audience? Is that a concern or, a challenge that you think you might come across? Because if so, I think that this could be for you. Okay, well, I think that you wanted to start just with a little background.
Yeah. No, the next slide is kind of, it's a goofy little pictorial of this thing. Was that 20?
I think it was around 2011 it started. Yeah.
2010, 2011. So NPR launched this. It was specific to states, and it was very specific to energy and environment reporting. This project called State Impact. And you, another buddy of ours, Terrence Henry, were sort of the lead reporters. And I ended up working with y'all on a series that I was doing about water access and water quality. And it was kind of, we were just sort of working together. But I was sort of watching you guys get this off the ground. And it was like, it was super interesting because y'all were trying to figure out sort of what your role is with industry, with policy, that was sort
absolutely, and the mission behind this particular project was to report on state policy and as it impacts, everyday people. And this being Texas, it kind of quickly morphed into also reporting on an absence of state policy sometimes as it might impact everyday people. But starting here helps because it also shows how your kind of job can change, as long as you stick with it long enough. This picture was taken out in West Texas because 2011 was the big drought year. And so we entered into this reporting project essentially like landing on the ground as water reporters and reporting on the Great Texas Drought.
Well, and I was working in state legislature.
That's right. Yeah.
I had taken a leave from KUT to get my policy degree at the LBJ school, and then I took an internship. It was an energy and environment internship program. And so I was actually working in the legislature for a representative called Lyle Larson, and he was very, very specifically interested in water policy. And so I was writing water bills and talking to these dudes a lot about sort of what we were trying to do. And it was this interesting, because Mose and I were talking about this before he came up here, like, when you're a journalist, you're kind of always going to be thinking like that. But then when you transition into, there are a lot of people who transition into, working in communications, like people who were journalists who go and do the PR for BP or for Exxon. Yeah. Like that's a big thing, and it's fine and it's good, except that you're always, I'm always thinking about like, all right, if Mose is calling me to ask me a question, like, I trust Mose. At the same time, I have to be I have to be, of course, depending on who I'm representing, I have to be sort of wary of what I tell you. Right?
Yeah, when you're playing that side of the fence.
Exactly. And so that for me, it was a couple of years at the legislature. I was just like, oh wow, like, you know, and also like thinking about, not that I'm leaking stories to you, but I am sending you an email. Hey, dude, this bill is pretty cool, and there's this one sort of thing that we're thinking about that's really interesting. We're going to get pushback from this legislator. So the way that we communicated, I mean, it was different because I knew sort of, I knew who to talk to.
Right. Yeah.
But also it was just like, yeah, being on the other side was interesting.
So this is something to think about when you consider journalism in general. And I don't know if we have many people watching this who are more on the journalism, side of things. But traditionally there's been a kind of like siloing of, if you're a reporter, you stay in that lane, and it's almost, if you go into the world of policy, if you go into politics, or we'll go work for the ledge like Andy did for a little while. There's a kind of old-fashioned sense, I think, that there's a certain kind of taint on you then, right? It's going to be harder to get back into reporting again because you need to have this kind of appearance of objectivity.
Yeah.
I think that's changed significantly, and it's something that I'd like to see reevaluated, because you get so much from being in other worlds as a reporter, right? You gain such a deeper understanding of the way things actually work. I mean, to be able to try to push legislation, for example, the Texas Capitol, and see how that actually works is such an asset to anybody who then wants to go back and describe the process to a general audience, or to report on the process, or to do investigative work, anything.
Yeah.
So really, I that's one point I think that we both like to raise as people consider the role of the journalist, is that it's not always, is that you can do great journalism regardless of your background.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, I would argue that you should go get, like,
yes.
I was thinking about, because when I was thinking about going to graduate school, it was like, okay, what you're supposed to do is go to, you go to journalism school and you try to get into Columbia, but I was like, that sounds boring. Like, I know how to be, I've been a journalist for a minute. Like, I don't need anybody to tell me how to do that. And so it's like, I'll go get a public policy degree.
Right.
So then when I took the job at Marketplace, it was absolutely one of the things that they focused on a ton. Was we took a ton of economics classes at the LBJ school, which makes a whole lot of sense. And so they wanted me to be sort of like well-versed in that. But it was also like, dude, you're not just another, J school grad. You're sort of bringing a different perspective. And I tell people that all the time. It's like, I was at Columbia this last week, and I told them, like, man, I would love to have more engineer journalists, like people who get graduate degrees in engineering and then go start reporting. Like, that would be so awesome, because it would be that sort of like really, really nice bridge of communicating. I mean, y'all, especially engineers, are thinking about things that are, but if you can figure out a way to communicate that, I mean, that's such an asset.
Yeah, and that's part of what we want to talk about next. So that's it. Well, that idea there about what's changed, a lot. We talked about coming in talking about water policy, but since then there's been the oil and gas boom, the fracking revolution. There's been any number of political upheavals and shifts in the country. We reported me most recently on the Texas power grid, the ERCOT grid, in the aftermath of the big blackout in 2021. So when you do come into this job as a reporter, you kind of often you'll find yourself focusing on something for a while and then shifting, and taking on a whole new job in a certain way in terms of what is really going to be most relevant to your audience. And that's one thing that keeps it really interesting. So I kind of like that.
No. It really is about sort of changing attitudes internationally, but also here in the United States, and also sort of the way that we're thinking about news. I mean, the blackout was huge news, especially here in Texas. And so then it was like, this is an opportunity to get into the nitty-gritty of exactly how ERCOT works, of exactly how the PUC works. So then it's sort of like, and we did this a ton at Marketplace. I mean, the whole job, right? I wasn't breaking any news stories when I was working in Marketplace. I was doing a little bit of investigative reporting, but it wasn't a whole lot of breaking news. It was, all right, how do we reflect on, how do we add to the conversation that people are having about what's happening in the energy industry right now? And so it was more about sort of intaking what's happening either with policy or with news or with what's happening in politics, and then trying to figure out a way to tell that story and sort of, maybe it's the history, maybe it's the backstory, We have a little clip from well, go ahead.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, what you just said, I think is really the crux of it. And if you are an audio journalist, as we both came into this, from radio, more and more you're expected to also do multimedia and write traditional kind of text stories that go around with the stories. But communicating complex ideas, in an easy to digest and understand way is really like the bread and butter of a radio reporter.
Yeah.
And to do it in a way that is engaging and entertaining. And so that, I think, is maybe what we bring to the table. You said you didn't do a lot of breaking news stuff or anything like that. Really what we're trying to do is maybe take an idea that is just very esoteric and let people understand what it means. And that is so important to science communication, which is kind of what we're here today.
Yeah.
One example of a story I did that I was pretty proud of is about the electric grid. And this is actually a story I did before the blackout. And it is about how the grid works. And essentially, if you're going to understand what happens when there is a blackout, you need to understand a little bit about the science of things, right? That there's a frequency on which electricity runs on the grid, and that is a beat that needs to be maintained at all times by the whatever the grid operator is in Texas or ERCOT. It could be any number of different ISO organizations around the country. How do you start talking about that to somebody who doesn't know anything about it and might not care?
Probably doesn't care.
Right. I got really lucky. I was interviewing a guy who used to work for ERCOT. His name was Warren Lasher. He's not there anymore, I don't believe. But after a long day of interviews and a kind of an open house at this organization, I think we were all getting a little tired. And he started. The guy's also a musician in his spare time, and so he started explaining this to me in terms of music. And that is exactly the kind of hook that you're always looking for if you work in audio journalism. Something that's going to grab someone by their ear and bring them in. And he starts talking about this beat that the grid operates on, and kind of goes on from there.
Its main job, really, is to keep that beat going.
It's strange.
Like a percussionist.
It's a drummer. It's Led Zeppelin. Come on, help me here.
Oh, geez.
Help me.
That's a little nicer than that humming sound, isn't it?
Yeah,
The drummer
From Led Zeppelin.
it starts this beat going.
John Bonham.
Oh, yeah.
John Bonham.
Talking
He says,
about
just like legendary drummer John
you can
Bonham,
play with the sound.
ERCOT doesn't keep the beat, bad things happen. But to keep it steady requires that all the electricity going on the
Sounds a
grid
little weird coming
equals the
from
amount
I'm sure
that
it's
is
the same
coming off the
getting
grid.
online, but
It's a balancing it.
to get these-
That's one of the real focus.
Well, and it's also, Moses is exactly right too. It's like you're so much of your job, especially when it comes to audio journalism, is so I'm asking a ton of questions, right? And I have a 15-20 minute interview. But there's going to be 17 seconds that are really good if it's a really good interview.
Yeah.
And so I'm listening the entire time, and it's probably not a question that I came to the table with. Honestly, most of the time, you're listening to their answers and you're listening to what they're telling you, and then it's like, man, I didn't know that. Can you dig a little deeper into, and then, you talk about it, and we'll sort of talk about this a little bit for those of y'all who were thinking about sort of how to communicate with journalists. You think in analogies, and you sort of think about the way that this makes sense as a story, as a narrative. That's how we're coming at this all the time. It's really, really wonderful when our sources can sort of think that way too. That's a different ask.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that there's actually a slide later on where we get into this a little bit, how you might deal with an interview if you're trying to explain complex ideas to a general audience.
So this was a question I had for Mose. Because especially when I was working, especially at Marketplace, like I was saying, inherently, I need somebody in Cleveland to care as much as somebody in Austin about this 1.5 minute long story. And so inherently, it's gonna be a little more superficial because I can't tell you about what's happening on Mopac because that person in Cleveland just doesn't care. And so what felt, and I remember having these sort of like, of course you have these existential sort of questions. It's like, am I dumbing this stuff down way too much? Like, am I giving the story its due? You were saying you think about it, especially when it comes to our form, you're not worried about that.
I'm not. Someone once told me that they'd rather tell part of a story well than the whole story poorly. And I think that that's probably a good way to approach communication, especially like science communication and journalism, especially if you're going to have another bite of that apple later on, right? You could tell the entire complex story behind some policy, some development, some news, and if it's so boring and so like just impenetrable, then nobody takes anything from that. It does not matter. It doesn't matter. All your effort completely wasted.
Yep.
You could tell part of that story in a way that's engaging that people might remember or come back and talk about later in a conversation, and you have succeeded in that case.
We always used to say, if somebody's listening to something and they have this, like that was it.
Yeah,
that is a total win.
Yeah.
If you have that moment, then it's just like
the metrics for journalists are very funny to like gauge success on, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're so hung up on awards sometimes is because there's like really so few ways to know what you've accomplished other than the occasional big you break a story and it actually like kind of changes policy or it's credited for some kind of development, which doesn't happen very often, frankly. When I'm at a dinner party or hanging out with somebody and they reference something that they've heard on the radio or that they've read, or maybe even something from a story I've done, I count that as like a win, right?
Sure.
I'm like, okay, that story really touched somebody and made them think.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say to this question is to not be afraid of repeating yourself.
Yeah.
It's a cursing and a bless that we immerse ourselves in these beats and become very well familiar with everything about them, follow developments. We're on, maybe on social media or Twitter, like following people that are obsessive about these small little things, really, in communities that are very invested in them. Most people are not. And it's okay to tell the same story, especially if you can tell it in a different way again and again, if it's an important enough one. I mean, like I said, I've been talking about the energy grid now for 2 years. And I did not expect 3 years ago to be doing that, but it strikes me to be a worthwhile, important thing to report on and educate people about. And so it's okay, I think.
No. And when you're going to editorial meetings, because obviously you're having your editorial meetings, maybe every day, maybe every couple of days, and it's like, all right, I'm gonna pitch you guys another bad story. Like it's something happening in LNG, and there's some tankers that are, and so of course I know the editors are gonna take it because it's newsy, but at the same time I'm sort of like, man, am I doing another LNG story? But if you figure out a way to, if it's news and you figure out a way to tell the story and you figure out, like my big thing was, all right, let's figure out one twist. What's the turn here? What's happening? So that even like I would do things like reference my own stories and make fun of myself, to be like, oh, you guys have heard this like 30 times because I told it to you 30 times. Right. If you're a loyal marketplace listener, but then you can kind of have fun. And it's like, okay, well, let's get past that and start talking about the reason I'm talking about this to you today.
Absolutely. What do we got next?
Oh,
this is kind of a tricky one. We have some more sound that Andy wanted to play.
Yeah.
This goes back to what we were just saying. Like, can you tell stories that do it all at once? Usually not. And if you're gonna endeavor to do that, it's going to be probably in the form of a series, podcast series like we've worked on at KUT, a feature series. But if you can do at least part of it in one go, I think that's really beneficial.
So I didn't mean to see myself up, but I was talking about natural gas. I talked about natural gas for an entire 2 years. Because it's a big sort of part of the oil and gas industry and the energy industry generally. And so because I'll let me tell you.
Place Morning Report. I'm David Brancaccio. Could there be a heating oil shortage in New England as things get colder? It's about how the pipelines run, but some are also blaming what's called the Jones Act, which requires cargo transferred between U.S. ports use U.S. ships. Here's Marketplace's Andy Uhler.
The Jones Act, officially the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, is fundamentally a protectionist measure. It requires ships bringing goods between U.S. ports to have been built and owned by Americans and run with U.S. crews.
The Jones Act protects the U.S.'s ability to have a base capacity to support maritime trade.
Gerald Morrissey is a partner at Holland and Knight in D.C. He says the law keeps the country's shipyards and merchant marine in business. And he says they have a pretty loud voice in Washington. So what about a temporary waiver that would allow non-U.S. ships to transport heating oil to the Northeast? Morrissey says that's not an easy ask.
A waiver is truly exceptional under the Jones Act.
He says a waiver normally requires proof that the shipping restrictions would harm U.S. national defense. Now, some say forget a temporary waiver. Let's just get rid of the Jones Act altogether. Colin Gravo at the libertarian think tank Cato Institute is one of them.
The law is not working. So let's scrap this and let's do something that actually works.
He says the domestic shipping industry is too small to compete on the global stage. And when heating oil needs to be shipped to other parts of the country, there shouldn't be restrictions to prevent it. In Austin, I'm Andy Uhler for Marketplace.
So it's a story about, right, it's a story about heating oil.
Right.
That's the peg, right? Because nobody really cares about the Jones Act, like 3 months ago or whatever. But it was a way for me to tell another story about heating oil, because of pipeline infrastructure. I could have told a pipeline story.
Yes.
And so the way that I was thinking about it was, all right, let's do a Jones Act explainer, and I got to do it in 1 minute. And so then you end up trying to find the pieces of tape that kind of help you. Well, they absolutely help you tell the story. And so it ends up being, all right, I have this one dude who's actually in favor of the Jones Act. He was really hard to find. Not a lot of people are big Jones Act fans. And then I have this dude who's like, oh, let's scrap it, let's get out of it. And so you end up sort of, and we were sort of, Mose and I were talking a little bit about there's arguments for both sides of them, and I completely understand that. But at the same time, the way that we're having this conversation is, look, the Jones Act is in place and has a really strong political voice. We need to be clear about that.
Yes.
At the same time, there are a whole bunch of folks who think it needs to be gone. Let's, and then honestly, that's all I can do, right? I have a minute, and it's this is on y'all now to figure out what you think about the Jones Act. I just gave you I teed it up for you,
And this is really especially with the time constraints that Andrew's often working with at Marketplace, to take these concepts and to take a minute and a half and try to cram all that in is it's a key challenge, the whole thing.
Yeah, no, it's the worst. And also you can expand to do things online. You can do a little bit more online with sort of more copy and things like that. For Marketplace, it was more about sort of what's going to be on the radio.
Yeah.
That was always.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the tough one.
The tricky one. Yeah. And
Carrie, if you need us to.
Yeah, and you can also let us know when we should open it up to questions.
Yeah.
We threw a bunch of things on this slide.
Yeah.
You want to
Sure.
I mean, basically, hopefully you're able to do this if you're a good journalist. But I have different thoughts about it. Well, number one, go to the right people for the right questions.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go to if you interview a politician that takes a kind of anti-science perspective on something like global warming. You're not going to hold them up as an expert on subjects, right? I mean, they're coming at this from a political perspective.
Yeah.
The same could be said for any number of politicians with any number of positions. I also try to be as clear as possible in my reporting about the material positions of people advancing different views, right? It's not just about who has the people. Everyone's going to say, "Oh, I have the best policy. I have the smartest policy proposal," right? This just makes sense. And in an arena of ideas, my ideas going to come out on top. But very often those, that masks people representing different interests, right? They different interests on part of industries, different political constituencies, and you can report on that. You can make it clear to your listener, wow, this may be someone who's advancing an argument, seemingly in good faith, and maybe very much in good faith for them. They're also representing an array of material interests that really, frankly, often is where the real action takes place.
Well, and like I was saying too, in the last line in that Jones Act piece, it's, hey, this senator just said this. Let's dig into exactly what this senator said and what argument they're making, right? Let's look at the data. Let's look at sort of the policy suggestions that are being made. And so it ends up being way more explanatory than you sort of getting involved in, for me anyway, certainly. It never was about sort of getting involved in politics and whether the politics were right or not.
Right.
It was, all right, this was a statement that got said. This is an argument that's being postulated. Let's dig in and see if it holds. If it does, good on it. That's fine.
Yeah.
And so we ended up doing a whole lot of sort of, let's explain the policy that's being sort of implied here, which I think helps. It ends up being sort of like, and to their credit, our editors sort of wanted to stay out of political fray.
Yeah.
And so it was like, figure out a way to sort of address what's happening in the news, but move on.
Yeah. Yes, Terry.
Well, let me just ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
Some reporting formats might want to directly call someone out.
Yeah.
If you're making a bad faith argument.
Absolutely.
Sunday talk show or something.
Yeah.
How do you see what y'all do in that kind of regard? You just let somebody make the argument?
I don't, but I also don't necessarily always want to enter into that conversation. I had this just happen recently with a guy who's an oil and gas regulator here in Texas, whose job is to he doesn't believe that global warming is real, right? And that's part of his politics, and it worked well for him politically. But in an interview, I'll say, well, what about climate change? And he laughs and says, that's just, are you kidding me? Am I doing anyone a service, like amplifying that or coming back at that? You have to ask yourself, what is the story you're telling?
Yeah.
And if that makes sense as part of the story I'm reporting, that makes sense. Otherwise, it's just kind of going to be a footnote. Like, this guy, nothing he does acknowledges this global crisis that we're experiencing, right? And that is upfront. That's a line in the story, but it's not going to be like instant fact check, man, you're wrong, and then let him get his perspective, and it's just like, then the whole thing just becomes like this muddy debate around like what this individual guy who really has no expertise in the matter is parroting.
And I had a 2-day editorial argument about something exactly like this. I was doing a story, and somebody had said, it was basically it was about climate change. It was about sort of how to how we're if and how we're going to use net zero, sort of what the implications are there. And I had somebody tell me that we were just not to worry about climate change, that we were just going to innovate our way out of it. Sure. And that's an argument that is absolutely happening. And I told my editors, I was like, hey, I think we have to include this because it's absolutely an argument. There's a big, sort of like mitigating and innovating and, sort of adjusting. But this is an argument that's, and so for me, that was tough, right? Like, so you're making those editorial decisions where it's like, all right, like, this is for sure an argument that people are making. How much voice do we give it? You're exactly right. Like, that's tough.
It absolutely just depends on what the story is. Yeah. And I'm all for those stories too. But I feel like there is especially when you're dealing with politicians, there are intentional ways of kind of derailing what you're actually trying to talk about by lobbying, kind of sometimes incendiary type statements at you. And it's like, I don't know if I'm going to take the bait today on that.
Yeah, right. Because they know you're going to go after it. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. Yep. All right. Oh yeah, I like this slide.
No, this is probably much more in line with what some of y'all might, be wondering.
Yeah.
So what, Andy, I'll pose this to you. Like when you're talking to experts, scientists, policy people, like how, what advice would you have for them?
No. We it's funny. I talked to a whole bunch of and what ends up happening too is when you have your sources, right? You end up. Obviously, you have to understand sort of the relationship that you have with your sources, but you can absolutely be friendly with your sources. and sort of say, hey, you should say that over again, because you were talking really fast, or
Right.
you know what I mean? And so you're trying to like, I want the best, I want you to sound, you expert to sound the absolute best possible, right? Because it's gonna make my story sound even better. Like it's totally selfish. But so you'll do things like, all right, and especially when you get to know your sources too, it's like, hey, I didn't really understand that. And so what I'm going to be doing too is I'm going to be asking probably the same question like 2 or 3 times, because it's going to elicit a different answer, and it's going to elicit a different response. And so for us, it's sort of like, yeah, it really does. It ends up being sort of like an oversimplification, in a good way, right? So like I'm telling my experts like, hey, nobody really cares about what you just said, and I'm sorry to break it to you, but like what we're gonna have to do here is figure out a way to sort of get, cut through that. And yeah, always talk slower than you think.
I typically, if I'm interviewing someone with, this type of background, especially someone who's a researcher or a scientist, I will start off by saying, imagine you're at a barbecue or in a dinner party, you're stuck with someone in the elevator, and you got to explain to them what you're trying to talk about with me. And then they will say something totally indecipherable, still, like that I don't get. And then you work from there.
Yeah.
And there is, as journalists, we never want to ask like leading questions.
Right.
We don't want to like necessarily like, coach people too much. But when you're dealing with complicated concepts, like Andy said, it is totally fine to work, I think, in collaboration with your source to make sure that what they're trying to say is clearly articulate.
Yeah.
Not to lead them, but it's just strictly as a matter of communication. And so that would be something that I think that a good reporter is attuned to.
Yeah.
I also like that you said it's okay to be friendly with people. I think that the more relaxed you can make people, the more relaxed you can be, the better the outcome. Generally.
The other thing we ended up doing that I liked a lot, specifically in Marketplace, was sort of thinking about the expert as a normal person, right? They're driving their car to work.
Yeah.
And so the tape that I use, and I understand, and I'm sure that this happens, where the tape that I use ends up being, man, it took me, 25 minutes to get my kid at school today, just because they're scientists, doesn't necessarily mean they're not just a person,
right?
Because maybe the setup that I needed was, look at how long these commutes are taking, or something like that, and the implications for electric vehicles, whatever.
Yeah.
So I end up sort of turning the expert into a normal person. From there, I'm always curious from their perspective. It's like, well, dude, I talked to you for 15 minutes about like the electric grid. What are you doing talking? Like, why are you using that tape?
Right. Yeah.
For me, it helped me tell the story.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah.
I would also, for those of you who are, have a technical background, who might be interviewed at some point, many times we'll interview people and not use a quote or tape, and that is often, I think, disappointing to the person you talk to. But almost all the time, that interview is still very worthwhile to us to gain an understanding of the material. It's just usually a question of time constraints or space constraints on what you're working on. Also, like Andy just referenced, if you're dealing in broadcasts, you might talk to somebody for an hour plus, and then come to find out that there's a 10-second soundbite right from the entire thing. Again, that's not to say that the whole thing wasn't an important process, especially for the reporter. It's just all that can't get squeezed into the amount of time that we generally have. And so those are 2 things to bear in mind if you ever are, if you ever decide to do an interview with someone.
Yeah, no. And like I was saying too, analogies are great. And I feel like I pose that question too. Is there any precedent for this? Are there any examples that you can sort of point to that people would sort of understand?
Yeah.
That's always super helpful, I think, for sort of, again, it's like you're talking about really, really big, sort of heavy ideas a lot of the time. It's like, man, if you can put it into an analogy about, it's kind of like walking your dog, but whatever.
Sure.
Like anything to sort of help us get there. Yeah. That's how I feel. It's like we, the expert, and me, the journalist, we're trying to get here. right?
Right.
We're trying to get somewhere. We're trying to tell this story as clearly as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's like, you don't have to think about it like a team, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
Like, all right, let's tell the story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some interviews are confrontational, but what we're describing here are not those interviews. These are things where we're trying to discuss complex ideas and concepts, and it's not typically that same kind of thing. It's like you're really you're working it with a common purpose to make a complicated idea well understood.
Yeah. Which leads us to this question. But I think I'm curious, Mose. You said that you were having conversations with other journalists.
This is just something I've noticed more, I think, in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yes.
And I don't know if it's just kind of general malaise, a larger kind of cultural malaise or something, but like
and just a ton of polarization.
Yes, the political polarization, absolutely. But I found more reporters kind of questioning, the value or the impact that even good journalism has in moving the needle in terms of this, like, improving society, creating a better world. I think that we do live in rather like pessimistic times right now, and I mean, I think for me, it's important. One thing that helps me when I start wondering about the value of what I do is to just think about history. Just think about like kind of like how we're in a certain stage in history right now that will change, and that things have been different before us and will be different again, and we as we live in this world, we can try to put something forward of value. If we believe it's truly a value, it may have an impact that we don't even understand fully in the moment, but hopefully will resonate.
And I think for folks in our line of work, specifically in public radio or in these sorts of media, I had to come to, like, I remember being at Marketplace for 2 years and being like, when I told y'all like we weren't breaking any stories, like I was hyper bummed out that I wasn't breaking any stories, because that's what you think you're supposed to be doing, right? You're a journalist and you're supposed to be. And so when it sort of became my reality, my truth, that it was, no, dude, you're explaining a lot of really complicated ideas, and you're sort of adding to the conversation. That took me a minute, right? Like I was bummed out because it felt like, no, like we're supposed to be breaking news, and telling people like I'm supposed to be the first one, and it's like, then you're doing another LNG story, and it's like, what? But once you start, it really did. It took, like, for me anyway, it took like this, okay, this is all right. And this is actually, there's a ton of value add here. It's just different.
Well, yeah.
Let's do it.
We're gonna open it up, see if there's.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, it went longer than we thought.
That previous slide you were touching on around the subject of the journalist, science, expert interface. And some impactful stuff I'd say that's happened recently around this whole concept of how uncertainty is dealt with in the scientific community, as in the journalistic community. I think climate change, probably the most relevant example here, where climate scientists will never say that this event was caused by global warming, or that whole caveat of like their necessity to research something and be honest, that they cannot be certain. When that in the media world, that empowers basically a counterfactual viewpoint. Nothing is certain, and you can't interview this expert and get an expert opinion out of it. So really kind of how in the energy space as it's become more relevant to clearly give a factual based response while also respecting the how that works in science
on the ground.
So I remember 5 or 6 years ago, I had been at Marketplace for about a year, and we would sort of habitually, and outlets still do this, we had this caveat about climate change. It was always sort of the next sentence was experts disagree about how much humans are, like it was that sentence. And I remember having a big conversation with my editors, and it was like, we should probably stop doing that. And I think, because of exactly sort of what you're talking about, or we need to come up with a more nuanced way to do this instead of sort of, and so that's tough, right? Like, especially when you have, I mean, you have people in the scientific community, you're exactly right, like that are writing books that are completely counter to what I have learned, you know, about what's happening when it comes to climate change. That's tough, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I think, you know, for me, we don't do ourselves as reporters any favors by obscuring uncertainty, because at the end of the day, you could, if you start to act specifically to kind of like play in that kind of more political space, you can lose trust, right?
Yeah.
And so and it really depends on like what you're talking about here, but like when you paint with a broad enough brush about something like climate change, you know, I'm confident, given what my understanding of it, the science that I know of it, to say certain things with a degree of certainty, right?
Yeah.
But I always do want to leave room, you know, when you're talking about science and science that you know, where there's still work being done on it, a lot, you know, to allow for some uncertainty there. I mean, I do think so. That said, I understand why there is ambivalence, you know, on the part of a lot of people you talk to not allow that to become ammunition to people with whom they may disagree, right?
Yeah.
And that is, we were talking about expert voices and science earlier, like it is not a fraught terrain, and obviously it very much is.
Yeah.
And so I try to be sensitive to that.
But even for us too, and we should let you guys know, when I was talking about sort of the editorial process, like we have steps in place for these sorts of things. Like I want my editor and I want, you know, the managing editor to have this conversation with me about, hey, how are we using this language? Like what is the nomenclature here? What are we thinking about? Because I might be set in, you know, like Mose was saying, I might be very confident in the way that I'm talking about it, but even my having to explain it to my editor, that helps. Like, so we have processes, I think, just journalists do, generally speaking, for that sort of, you know, to sort of underscore these questions that everybody's having.
The danger is that, you know, you become, and you know, maybe it's inevitable just given the way things are right now, but if you do begin obscuring uncertainty or other, you know, perspectives, you're accused of bias, right? And that's, you know, perhaps rightly, and that's not anything to you that is good. All we have, you know, is trust. You know, that's really the only thing that reporters have is that.
Let me go for a follow-up. Does anybody have another question after a follow-up? All right, I'll come to you two next. Follow-up on this is trust of going to your editor or managing editor. And the reporters perhaps questioning the value of their jobs lately. I assume a lot of this is due to the different medium in which people can report, like going on Substack or something, and in which you're everything. You're the editor and you're the journalist and you're everything. You're that check. So how do you see the value of that kind of format versus the formats, I suppose, that y'all are still in, where you might have, you know, different people.
Yeah, sort of legacy media. Yeah. No, I have a bunch of cousins who they call me a member. Yeah, I'm a it's a pejorative, and I forget what it is.
The mainstream media?
Yeah, no, it's yeah. Oh, the big I think I'm part of the media complex.
Oh wow,
which is nice.
Yeah,
it's a good place to be. No, and so there's a lot of watching podcasts on YouTube, and you're right. Those folks can kind of say whatever they want, right? And you can also, I mean, what's happened now, what I've found is the stuff that we're doing often isn't going to be something you can just sort of Google, and if you have an opinion about something, you can find something that will agree with you. Ours doesn't really necessarily do that all the time. And so I think there's a little bit of tension between just sort of that. It's like, well, if you can just say anything you want, I don't know. Like, yeah, I don't know. I don't see a lot of value in that, except that, you know, I guess sort of getting more voices out there is always good. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Online has allowed for communities to form.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think in really positive ways where people can, who are focused on certain issues and engaged in very niche things can kind of come together and share information, you know? So, and in a way, it also makes our jobs easier. And, you know, like if you're like a grid head, you know, if you follow the electric grid, there are any number of people on Twitter you can go to and follow who, once you've kind of vetted them, you understand that they are careful in, you know, what they talk about in their thinking, and you understand whatever position they may be coming from, can be wonderful resources. And for a general audience, if that's something that interests you, that's available to you too now in a way that it never was, you know, 10, 15 years ago. That kind of just like instant expertise. I also frees us up, I think, on some level to be more generalists about this stuff, right? There are places you can go for your like niche, you know, kind of information, and then there are the people that can translate that to a broader audience. The downside, of course, as Andy said, is that there's just a lot of crap online that is not true, and that is unfortunate that you know, people again people will often seek what reinforces, you know, their preconceived ideas, and that's I don't know what you do with that.
It's also tough that lends to us having to spend a lot of time sort of refuting, you know, if it gains enough traction, then part of our job is to refute what's being said online that's not true. And so instead of doing your enterprise reporting or doing other reporting, you're sort of reacting to what's being said, and you're trying to just make sure and clarify things. And so it can be, and that's a really, I mean, for some, that's a really good strategy, you know, to make us have to, and a lot of politicians do this too.
Absolutely,
You know, it's for us having to fact check and us having to sort of refute what's going on.
I think I told the PolitiFact reporter once, is like, just ignore that one.
I guess my question was kind of similar. It was like, how do you try to reach people whose beliefs are based in like misinformation, or how much do you consider that when you're making a story?
For me, I mean, you know, people, it really depends on who you're talking to again. You know, I mean, some people are paid to not understand, you know, things, you know, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it's hard to convince, right? It's hard to convince someone who's paid not to understand something to understand. But when you're dealing with just, you know, random people you interview, which again, I think we should always be doing. I know that this is about talking to experts, but really the best stories are often when you just talk to regular people, for lack of a better word, you know, about how some of these bigger issues, you know, impact them. You know, people can have all sorts of different ideas and all sorts of different notions about the way the world works that you may disagree with, and that you or that may be flatly wrong. I try to treat that very differently. I mean, you don't know where someone's coming from. People form their ideas based on their environment, their upbringing, where they grew up, and it often doesn't say anything about their value as, you know, as an intellect, as an individual. It's just a function of where you're from. So just treat everyone like a human, you know, and be that's the way I try.
One thing that I found has been actually really helpful in this idea when you're talking to people, and you know, it even, you know, it might be at a family dinner, right? It might be your relatives or something. And so what I've done sort of very consciously is found things that we can agree upon, and then sort of base things in fact that we can then sort of start the conversation. So we might not necessarily have to have a big conversation about, you know, climate change or whatever, but if we can talk about, you know, liquefied natural gas or whatever, and benefits and things like that. Like if we can agree on some stuff, then maybe we can start to have this conversation. So you sort of have to have this like baseline, for me anyway, with people who I think sort of are not agreeing with stuff I'm saying on purpose. If you can have a baseline of, all right, what can we agree on? What can we sort of agree on? And what's based in fact, right? Then that's sort of like, that's your baby step, right? I think that helps.
Those are the question.
So when you're telling a story, especially a breaking news story, how do you make sure that you approach it from the right perspective, and then you can turn it into a bigger follow-up story or a bigger story?
Yeah.
That's a good question, especially when it comes to like the type of reporting we were talking about earlier, where you're turning a lot of our jobs is like turning 1 minute spots for radio. It was, and often in that context, I will be like, well, this is just my first bite of this apple, and then what's great about having done this podcast, for example, is that you can use that tape and use that background information to come at it sooner. Breaking news is a strange beast, right? Because if a lot of times it's just you're letting people know something that's happening immediately right now, and it does not have to be a big dissertation on something.
Well, and like you said too, it might be, hey, this news just broke. I'm gonna dig into this little facet that I didn't really understand, because when you're especially when you're doing sort of shorter pieces and you're doing breaking news, you're only going to be able to lean on the things that you can definitively say, right? And so then that might lend itself to, I'm going to follow up on this thing that I didn't, it was kind of, I don't really know what's going on here. And it may turn into a 6-minute story. It might turn into nothing. But that's part of you're exactly right. That's part of the process for sure.
Is there another question?
Questions?
Yeah.
So like a lot of modern journalism is kind of sensationalist. I know, maybe you would call it journalism in some of those scenarios.
Sure.
I guess maybe more of a question or answered by just picking the sorts of media that you trust more, but I'm just worried about saying too much or saying the wrong thing to a journalist that might spin it in a way that my perspective is lost.
Yeah.
And it, kind of has the opposite purpose of me informing people.
Absolutely.
Kind of taking my perspective and using it against.
Well, and it's also more harmful than me, talking about you, in your commute to school or whatever. No, I think that's tough, right? And if you're the Energy Institute guys will be able to tell you this better than we would, but there are probably some outlets you don't take the interview request. Part of our job is, again, it's all about trust, and so for us, it's
you need best to try to do homework with some, if you get somebody trying to talk to you about something like that you could worry about, being misrepresented. Make sure that it's an organization or a reporter that you think will be fair. Follow up if
absolutely,
if you think that there was a misunderstanding. I actually recently had something happen, never happened to me before, but in my years of reporting, but I was interviewing this guy and he cracked a joke, I guess.
Okay.
I'm not going to say what it was, but he said something that I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I took it to be serious, right? And then he called me after the story published and he said, I was joking. And I went back and I listened to the tape. Was he joking?
Yeah.
And I didn't react as though he had been joking. I reacted as though it had been a real thing. But I did go back and update the story to say that this was a statement made in jest, apparently. And listening to the tape, I said maybe he was joking.
Yeah.
So if they're gonna joke, make sure that they know you're joking.
I had one of those. This is a great one too, and I got a lot of reaction from the that I talked to. What she had done, the tape that she had given me was the other perspective. So I had to set her up with. She thinks that the people on this side.
Oh yeah, that's very tricky.
And then the tape was her saying what she thought they were saying, right? So then when you listen to it, she heard. That she was saying that, instead of that, and so she was like freaked out. I do not blame her at all.
Yeah, that's very different.
But it was like, oh no, because what happened was the audio you could absolutely tell what was happening, but online we needed to change, it was like a conjunction or something. It didn't work. And so it was just like, oh no, and of course you're like, it was awesome tape. Like,
Yeah.
But it just didn't work. And so it was like, oh God, so then you're scrambling. And I don't think we had the issue of correction, but of course you would.
Yeah.
Sort of if you need to.
There are different standards that different newsrooms have as well, but some reporters will do like quotes, verifications essentially. Others don't, but that's not where they would change a quote, but just simply say, you said this, right? And this is, and maybe you could provide more context then. This is actually one of the beauties of radio, is that we're always recording, so you can't fully, except in that very unique situation that I described, like really completely take someone out of context. So,
Anything else?
Question.
So I've noticed this a lot online where someone puts out a press release or someone does a story for the first time, and then you have all these like news outlets that just literally it's almost like copy paste to
they're ripping off
and they don't fact check or anything. So like you have this phenomenon where someone makes a mistake or it's not a good story in the first place, and then it blows up. I've noticed that happening a lot. I'm just curious if you see that, like what you think of that.
Well, and what's happening there, it feels like, is sort of newsroom resources, right? You have somebody digging into and just basically reprinting press releases. That's never going to work. Like, don't do that. From our perspective anyway. Like a press release, it of course it depends on where it's coming from, but it's like, I'm going to dig into that immediately. It's like, because of course they want you to take how they phrased everything. They want you, and it might be right, it might be wrong. And so I think there are places online now that just sort of shoot those out. It may absolutely, I was going to say, it might be
absolutely.
that are just posting these things immediately as they get them. So then, it's our job to dig in.
Yeah, a lot of that goes back to that other question about how you deal with like misinformation or just like the kind of chaos of online media scape. And it's like we were flooded by stuff like that. And you have to be, I think, a kind of a discerning consumer at some point, because it's going to be the reality now. I don't know any way to counter that, completely counter that. You can have as many fact-checking websites as you want, this stuff is going to go on. But on the other hand, I think again, if you are if you are a reporter who comes at it from a rigorous kind of tradition of reporting out the facts, that our value is made ever more clear in that chaotic environment, I hope.
Well, and what's super interesting too, Brian, is that even the project that I'm working on this year, we're talking about AI. We're talking about sort of aggregating things so that I can get as much data and information as I can, with a robot doing a lot of that work, which is great. but that's exactly right. The onus is on me then, as sort of the editorial lead of this project, to make sure that this stuff is real, and that it's and so that it ends up being you sort of outsource to the AI what you can, and then everything has to then be filtered through me, or a team or whatever. And so it's interesting because like there's tons of great stuff that comes from that. It's just a matter of sort of like making sure you understand where your role is.
That's a real good teaser for the end. AI here.
It's quick, quick answer.
Cool, just kind of on that topic, like where, with the increasing complexity of how media is being generated and the different sources that are available, what is your opinion on the public's knowledge of the role of journalism, and how it's taught in the system now? I mean, at least when I was going to elementary school in the ancient past, there was a civics class or something where you learned the basic function of where journalism sits in the policy creation world. And I feel like that's a bit missing, or at least quite antiquated in how it's treating what I say is a more impactful and more complex subject. So
this goes, I think, back to the question about like the value of what we do, because that was the kind of narrative of it. When we started out, your job is to report facts and policy to a to a population that then is informed by that and makes more informed decisions to advance, democracy, like in the democratic system. And I think that, we live in a much more, like I said, kind of pessimistic time right now where people aren't as convinced that that is like, there's that like through channel of information from the, factual reporter to the public to, I think I kind of lost.
No, but at the same time, it doesn't behoove us to ignore the realities of the situation,
Right.
Like these things are happening, and so we can't just. I mean, I think a lot of times we end up, all that other stuff that's going on out there is like we kind of hold ourselves to a different higher standard or whatever, and maybe it's appropriate, maybe it isn't, but it's like these realities are real, and so we're going to have to figure out a way to adjust. Maybe our role becomes even more important. We hope. I don't know, but I think just sort of taking our head in the sand and saying, well, all those other things that are going on, that's just fake news, and we don't need to worry about that. It's like, no, dude.
I guess just to quickly end on this. One thing that I think has taught me is that it's more than there's the saying facts matter, right? And that's absolutely true. But when you're dealing now in this new environment, it takes more than that too. It takes great storytelling. It takes being engaged, not being like presumptuous and pretentious, as I think some like legacy kind of media can be sometimes. Yep. And if we're going to exist and thrive and advance good reporting in this environment, these are all things that we need to learn from. We can't just stand and bemoan how things are now. Like we need to take what we can from it and learn from it.
Yep.
All right, so let's thank our speakers today. Mose, Buchele. Environment for Katie and you. Thanks very much.
Yes, everybody. Thanks,